Welcome to the Authority Podcast. My name is Dr. Sanford Richmond. Today my guest is Charles Thomson. He's a multiple award-winning investigative journalist based in the UK. He's also been a Michael Jackson writer and historian for over a decade now. He's been a loud and harsh critic of the controversial documentary HBO's Leaving Neverland. And on the show, I will talk to him about his critique of the documentary and his thoughts about the main participants of the film, Wade Robson, James Safechuck, and Leaving Neverland director Dan Reed. We also discuss other works he has done on Michael Jackson and other high-profile cases he's covered related to child sexual abuse. So, Mr. Charles Thomson.
Hi there. How are you doing?
All right. Thank you for being on my show.
That's no problem. Thank you for asking me.
I appreciate it. Let's get started. I've been wanting you on my show for so long now. We communicated with each other through email for the last couple of months. So it's finally good to have you as a guest.
Yeah, sorry about that. We were lined up, and then I had I had a wisdom tooth issue, right? So no, it's good. No, you back and healthy and good to go. I really appreciate this. So I've seen you on social media, specifically on Twitter, posting your thoughts about Leaving Neverland. I've seen and heard you make the rounds on various radio and podcast shows in recent months, just shredding the credibility and integrity of the Leaving Neverland documentary apart with just like ruthless efficiency and detail. And you've been doing this for months now, even before the Leaving Neverland documentary aired. So let me start off by asking you this. What made you so confident in criticizing the credibility and integrity of this documentary before it even aired? Okay, so the two protagonists of the documentary, Wade Robson and James Safechuck, have both been involved in extensive litigation with the Michael Jackson estate for the last 5 years or so. They've been suing the estate, trying to obtain millions of dollars, and their claims have been thrown out of court repeatedly, and they're in the middle of an appeal at the moment. And that litigation over the last 5 years or so has generated many, many hundreds of pages of legal documents in the form of sworn declarations, deposition transcripts, motions, judgments, etc. And anybody who's been following the case and following those documents as they've been published will be aware that there are significant problems with these guys' stories. One of them was caught committing perjury in his creditor's claim. So we knew before the film came out that the two protagonists on whose stories it was based had credibility issues. Okay.
So for the people who don't know, new revelations has come out in the last couple of weeks about this Neverland train station controversy, in which James Safechuck describes that a lot of his abuse happened in an upstairs room in a train station located in Neverland Ranch. And remember, Safechuck swears the abuse stopped when he was 14 years old. So now what has just come out is that Mike Smallcombe, I'm not sure if I'm saying his last name right. He's a Michael Jackson biographer. He revealed on his Twitter account it would have been impossible for Jackson to molest Safechuck in a room in Neverland's train station because the train station, wait for it, didn't exist in 1992 or any time before. It was approved for construction in 1993 and it didn't open until 1994. And then Smallcombe posted on his Twitter account the construction papers and permits to prove his point. In 1994, Safechuck was 17 and by that time bigger and taller than Michael Jackson. So to put a spin on it, Leaving Neverland director Dan Reed changes the narrative and says, well, Safechuck was right about the abuse, but wrong about the date. So, Charles, back to you. What do you make of these revelations that has come out about the Neverland train station abuse story?
It's even worse than you just framed it, and it sounds bad, okay, like even your version. But so in the film,
Safechuck says that when Michael Jackson began grooming and molesting him, they had what he describes as a honeymoon period.
Right.
And he says that during the honeymoon period, which was early in their relationship, they were physically intimate all the time. And Michael Jackson was abusing him sexually on a daily basis.
Right.
And he says that one of the locations where Michael Jackson was abusing him on a daily basis was the Neverland train station.
Right.
And he vividly describes the interior of the train station. Now, this version of the story that he tells in the TV show places that abuse in the train station in 1988-89.
Right.
And we now know that the train station did not even open until 1994. And as you correctly say, in his sworn declarations, in his ongoing litigation with the estate, he says that Michael Jackson stopped molesting him when he was around 14 years old in 1992 because he got too old for him.
Right.
And the whole narrative of this film, is that Michael Jackson molests boys, and then when the boys hit puberty and get too old, he then ditches them and moves on to a younger boy. That's the whole narrative that they're selling with this documentary. But when the contradiction comes out, when it's revealed that this location where Safechuck is describing his abuse it did not exist when he was the age he said he was, Dan Reed, the director of the documentary, goes onto Twitter and says, well, there's no dispute about when the train station was built, but what's in dispute is the dates of the abuse.
Right.
So James Safechuck was abused after the train station was built. Well, firstly, he's now accusing his own star witness of perjury because James Safechuck has signed not one but two sworn declarations in which he states that Michael Jackson never abused him after 1992.
Right.
So in order to defend his documentary, he's throwing its star witness under the bus by calling him a perjurer, but also he's upended the entire narrative of his documentary. So he's just presented a 4-hour documentary which is built on the premise that Michael Jackson abuses prepubescent boys and then throws them away like trash and when they get too old and replaces them. And he's now, in order to salvage the documentary in light of this contradiction, is saying, actually, Michael Jackson continued to be sexually involved with Jimmy Safechuck when he was a 6-foot adult.
Right.
So nothing about this makes sense. And the most heinous thing, really, was that Oprah Winfrey appeared on the Trevor Noah program a couple of weeks ago, and she dismissed this train station revelation by very sort of pithily by saying, well, you know, who cares if they don't remember if something happened on a Wednesday or a Thursday? That doesn't mean if they're lying. That doesn't mean they're lying. Well, you know, we're not talking about was it Wednesday or Thursday. We're talking about a 6 or 7 year fissure in the timeline, which moves the abuse from being of a young boy to a 6-foot adult.
Right.
So this is a catastrophic injury to their allegations. It really badly damages the credibility of the accusers and of the documentary itself. And I mean, the way Dan Reed is responding to it is a sort of a bit like closing his eyes and sticking his fingers in his ears.
Right.
He just doesn't seem to be addressing it properly, and when he does address it, he just completely misstates the facts.
Right, and I will get to Oprah in a minute because I want to talk about Oprah. I'm glad you mentioned her because I want to talk about Oprah in that narrative in a few minutes. So I'm glad you mentioned her, definitely. So I want to talk about you a little bit. So you start covering Michael Jackson years ago for the Sun newspaper. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I think I wrote about Michael Jackson before. So when I was a student journalist, when I was a teenager, I used to write for fan websites as like writing practice.
Okay.
And those included Michael Jackson websites. So I developed contacts through that sort of fanzine culture within the Michael Jackson sphere. And so when I graduated into freelance reporting, which I did when I was in my late teens, early 20s, while I was at university studying journalism, I used those contacts and shifted my Michael Jackson writing into the professional sphere. Okay. So I began working for I was not directly employed by the Sun, but I was what you would call a stringer. So I was a freelance reporter, and I had a direct line to the Sun, and I would pass them stories. So I did that for about maybe a year. It began maybe 6 months before Michael died, or slightly less, and then continued for some time after he died. But of course, after he passed away, there was eventually the interest dwindled, and although I was doing other bits of showbiz reporting, the Michael Jackson stuff fell away.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, but is the Sun newspaper seen as a tabloid?
Yes, it is a tabloid newspaper.
Yeah, because no, go ahead.
You would not equate it with something like the National Enquirer.
Okay.
So within the context of Britain, the phrase tabloid versus broadsheet is basically it refers to the size of the newspaper. So you have tabloid size and broadsheet size, which is much bigger, and it refers to the tone with which the newspaper is written, in terms of it would be a lot more colloquial and conversational, rather than a broadsheet, which would be written more in a kind of a literary way.
Well, because we all know that tabloids have been the bane of Michael Jackson's existence in life and in death. So I was like, okay, this is a tabloid, but you're saying it's more nuanced than that.
Yeah, so a tabloid in Britain is not quite the same as a tabloid in America, because our libel laws in Britain are much, much stronger than yours in America. Okay. So there is even a phenomenon called libel tourism, where people will sue in Britain over a story that's been published everywhere, because in Britain they're most likely to win.
Okay.
So for a tabloid in the UK does not go to the extremes of, say, a National Enquirer. So, like, the National Enquirer has reported about 5 times in the last 5 years that Cher is on her deathbed, which of course she's not. Right. So that you won't find that in a British tabloid, because it's defamatory and they could be sued quite easily. But I mean, yes, the tabloids did take liberties with Michael Jackson, because it reached a point where it would have been very difficult for Michael Jackson to argue that he had been defamed, because in a British court you must demonstrate that you have been injured by the claim that's been made. So if somebody was to write something negative about Michael Jackson, he would have to demonstrate that that had damaged his reputation.
Right.
So what the Sun would probably do, for example, or another newspaper, is argue that Michael Jackson's reputation was so sullied already that it could not be injured. It could not be worsened. So, which is effectively the same argument that Michael Jackson's own estate is making at the moment in its tax dodging lawsuit with the IRS, where they're basically saying Michael Jackson's reputation was so deep in the toilet that we undervalued his name and likeness because it wasn't worth anything. So yeah, the Sun is a tabloid, and the Sun does have a bad history with Michael Jackson, and I did write and speak extensively after I stopped doing that about some of the bizarre things that would happen. So I would send in information. I would send in information about Michael Jackson's rehearsals. So I'd get some information from some sources about what songs he was rehearsing for the upcoming tour. This Is It show, right? So I would send that into the Sun, and then what you would find is it would come out the other end, and it would say, blah blah, like Jacko, who recently recovered from a flesh-eating disease in his face, and then the story would continue. You'd just be going, where did that come from?
That was my question. Like, what was that like when you was covering him? What was their intentions? Like, did they want to find dirt on him? Did they want to manipulate coverage in some type of way on him? Because that's what it sounds like.
Well, it was a really fascinating phenomenon. So the person that I used to deal with one person only. They were my point of contact, and that person was the most stringent fact checker I have ever met in any job I've ever had in the media. This guy was like, to the point where he was a pain in the arse. Like, so he would be asking me to fact check things which were so fundamental. Like, can you prove to me that Thriller was released in 1982 or whatever, that sort of thing.
Okay.
And so he was incredibly impressive, and he was absolutely obsessive about making sure that every detail that I'd given him was correct.
Right.
And then at some point in the process, after he would send the stories off to be put in the paper, all this weird stuff would get inserted into them. So it was almost like it was part of the machinery of the newspaper.
Right.
Rather than it being on the part of the reporters, it seemed to go beyond the reporters and hit a certain point in the machine.
Right.
And then all this crazy stuff would get added in, and then it would come out in the newspaper on the other end, and you'd be going, how the hell did that get in there? And so the worst example, which I wrote about, was when Evan Chandler, the father of Geordie Chandler, committed suicide. He shot himself in the head.
Right.
And the son contacted me and said, look, Geordie Chandler's dad has killed himself, so we need you to send us some information about the 1993 case.
Right.
And I was thinking, oh, fantastic, because normally every media outlet gets that wrong.
Okay.
The whole 1993 case, they just get it all wrong all the time. So I sent them a whole bunch of court documents and said, this is great because we're finally going to get it right. And then the next day, the story came out, and absolutely everything I sent them had been ignored, and they just put in a bunch of incorrect information. And that was the last time I worked with them on a Michael Jackson story, actually, because I was very cheesed off about it, and I ended up writing a blog about it, which kind of catapulted me into phase 2 of my Michael Jackson writing life, which was all about the media.
That's what I want to get into right now. That's so as the years progressed, even after his death, you continue to do stories on him for other publications, correct?
Yeah.
And so as you continue to do stories and features on him, you write this article in the Huffington Post in 2010, if I'm not mistaken, called "One of the Most Shameful Episodes in Journalistic History." This was an in-depth article that covered the testimony and transcripts of his 2005 trial in comparison to the media coverage of the trial. And so this is a two-part question. What was the motivation in writing this article? And after intense research and investigation, what did you discover after completing this article?
Okay, so the motivation was it was coming up on the 5th anniversary of the verdicts in the Michael Jackson trial.
Right.
And of course, Michael had died less than a year ago. He died in June. I started working on this article probably in about February or March of 2010. And I was kind of at a loose end. I'd graduated from journalism or from university with a journalism degree into the global recession. So effectively, it was like incredibly hard to find a salaried job in the media because everybody was cutting staff instead of hiring them.
Right.
And so I went freelance kind of out of necessity, and I was doing okay, but it kind of left me with a lot of spare time. So I'd just written my first piece for Huffington Post, which is also about Michael Jackson. It was about the phenomenon of copy and paste journalism and how a completely scurrilous and inaccurate story by one outlet had been copied and pasted to the point where it got reproduced hundreds of times and not one media outlet fact-checked it. And then I thought it would be interesting. The response to that article was very good. And so I thought it would be interesting to use Michael Jackson to explore another issue within the media, which was the kind of the dumbing down of court reporting and how the pursuit of ratings and sales could incentivize journalists to report in a misleading or a salacious way on something as serious as a court case. So it was like the first article was like a springboard into the second one, and the second one I spent months working on. And in fact, it was a real rush to finish it in time for the anniversary, 13th of June 2010, so the 5th anniversary of the verdict. I think I finished writing it at about midnight on the 12th.
Okay, right.
So and it was a lot of like writing until 4 o'clock in the morning and all that sort of stuff. So I was basically going through comparing newspaper coverage. So I had the transcripts already, the trial transcripts. I was rereading those. And then I actually blagged my way back into my old university so I could gain access to all of their old newspaper archives. They had these fantastic digital newspaper archives, so I could go back and check all the coverage. And then I was just comparing the trial transcripts from key events within the trial,
Right.
like the accuser's testimony and Pajama Day and the 1108 prior bad acts evidence, just certain key points within the trial.
Right.
And I was comparing what happened in court and what did the media say happened in court.
Right.
And I was finding massive discrepancies.
Because why I wanted you on my show was because, again, you have been just, shredding the credibility of this documentary apart for months now, and even before the documentary aired. Also, what makes you unique is that not only are you a Michael Jackson writer and historian, you have done investigative journalism, award-winning investigative journalism on child sex abuse scandals before. Is that correct?
Yeah, I after being freelance for a couple of years, I got fed up with that primarily because I'm far too lazy and dumb at maths to keep filling out tax returns. It was just the worst job in the world. So I decided I needed to go PAYE and get a salaried job. So I moved into the regional press.
Okay.
And as part of my job in the regional press, I had to cover court, I had to cover crime, all sorts of stuff. And over the years, I have been involved in various stories about child abuse, which we've won awards for at the newspaper. Right. So one of the first ones was a Jehovah's Witness church in the UK, which was it had known that one of its members was abusing children, and instead of reporting them to the police, had decided to punish them by making them mop the floor for a month or something, which basically left them at large, and they were able to continue abusing more children because nothing had been done properly to deal with the situation. And the judge in that case was extremely critical of the church. There was another case where we obtained data which showed that teachers across a region of the UK were being consistently found guilty by disciplinary proceedings of sexual misconduct towards pupils in their schools, but the schools were not reporting it to the police because they didn't want the bad publicity, and so they were simply sacking the teachers, and then they were going and getting jobs in other schools without anybody knowing what had happened. And then the most recent, which has been a 4-year investigation, which is still ongoing.
Is that the Shoeberry thing?
Yes,
okay.
Yes. So there was a kind of a deprived seaside town in the UK in the 1980s called Shoebury. It had once been a very popular tourist destination in the sort of the 50s and 60s before the advent of affordable international flights. And then once people were able to start affording to go abroad on their holidays, British seaside resorts started drying up. The tourism went right down the pan, and the areas became impoverished. And there was a phenomenon across the UK in that period where, because these areas were so impoverished, they became magnets for paedophile activity. So paedophiles would come in with some money and flash it about, and they would kind of seduce the kids and co-opt them. And we were alerted to a case in Shoebury whereby 2 men had been running a large paedophile ring and had been prosecuted for running that ring, but none of the other abusers had ever been pursued or brought to justice, and also the 2 perpetrators had been given suspiciously light sentences. They'd been looking at life in prison for the charges that they were charged with, but on the day of their trial they were allowed to enter into an extremely lenient plea bargain. And everybody else involved in the case, all the professionals that were dealing with the victims, were just left completely baffled by what had happened. And we've been digging and digging for the last 4 years, and we've uncovered that the main perpetrator, the leader of the paedophile ring was actually working for the police as an informant at the same time that the police were supposed to be investigating him. And that case is ongoing, and we still haven't got to the bottom of it. But we've had, to date, something like 8 national nominations for that. We just had 4 come in the other day. I think it's 9. So we've had 9 nominations.
Wow. Okay.
So 4 of them are pending, and in 4 of the 5 prior nominations, we've brought home an award.
Wow! Well, congratulations.
Thank you
for your journalism and your service. Catching these people. So focusing on your investigative journalism experience and history, what has been the difference between the child sex abuse stories you have covered and reported on in the past compared to the allegations levied against Michael Jackson?
The primary difference, I would say, is that with the Michael Jackson allegations, you never, ever find somebody with an allegation who is not compromised. Every single person who has ever accused this guy is compromised. So the very first case, you have a father, actually, who accuses Michael Jackson of molesting his son. This is Evan Chandler accuses Michael Jackson of abusing his son, Geordie Chandler. Geordie Chandler denies it to investigators and insists that his dad is lying and just wants money. Then
stop right there. I'm sorry. See, I didn't know that. See, Jordan Chandler at first denied it all along. He denied it at first.
He denied it at first. He even spoke to investigators on the record and said, "My dad is lying. He wants money." And then the Jordan Chandler's stepfather, whose name is Dave Schwartz, he is suspicious of Evan Chandler and starts tape recording his conversations with Evan. And he captures Evan on tape saying that he has no idea whether his own allegations are true, but that he's told Michael Jackson exactly what he wants from him. And if he doesn't get it, then he's going to destroy him so he never sells another record again. And Schwartz says to Chandler, "And is that what's best for Geordie?" And Chandler replies, "That's irrelevant to me." Then Chandler takes custody of Geordie from his mother, June. So basically has a court-appointed week-long custody visit with Geordie, but then never returns him to his mother. And once he has Geordie in his custody, he administers him a drug, which is called sodium amytal. He uses his position as a dentist to obtain and administer this drug, which sounds insane. I know this sounds insane, but he actually admitted it in a TV interview. So he administers this drug, which at the time was considered to be like a truth serum. And once he administers this drug, Geordie Chandler changes his story and starts saying that Michael Jackson did molest him. Now, the problem with this is that we later learn that sodium amytal is not a truth serum. Sodium amytal makes people highly suggestible and is linked to many false memory cases. For example, people who go into sort of hypnotherapy type situations are given the drug and then wake up saying that they were abducted by aliens and probed, that sort of thing. Or lots of old kind of satanic, the satanic panic, everybody was suddenly saying they were victims of satanic ritual child abuse and all that stuff. A lot of that was linked to sodium amytal. So you have a kid who first says he's not molested, then says he is molested. The dad's on tape saying that he doesn't know if it's true and he wants money. And then when the kid does say he's molested, he only does it under the influence of a mind-altering drug that's linked to false memories. And he then gives a description of Michael Jackson's genitals, which turns out to be wrong. The police serve a warrant on Michael Jackson, which forces him to stand naked in front of police officers while they handle and photograph his genitals. And when they compare the photographs to the description, there is not a match. So that is ground zero. That's the very first allegation. Every allegation which comes from that case, every subsequent allegation is spawned by that case. So, and I've not even mentioned the fact that that case is financially motivated. The father files a lawsuit seeking millions of dollars from Michael Jackson, eventually extracts a settlement. So now you have a roadmap. So anybody who wants to make an allegation against Michael Jackson, and nobody ever has prior to Geordie Chandler, anyone who wants to make an allegation has a roadmap. They know exactly what they need to say in order to be consistent with the first allegation, because it's been all over the newspapers. So number of accusers is irrelevant, because in any case like that, you're going to get copycats, particularly if they think they're going to get a massive payout. And similarity of accounts is irrelevant, because anybody that wants to give a similar account can just copy it out of whatever newspaper they've just been reading. So, but it goes beyond that. So every single person who accuses Michael Jackson subsequently goes straight to a civil lawyer and tries to sue him. There is never an accuser who simply walks into a police station and says, Michael Jackson molested me, what are you going to do about it? They always go to a lawyer and say, let's get rich. So that is massively damaging. And then the other commonality between all of the accusers of Michael Jackson is that they all have nonsensical, inconsistent accounts. They are all caught lying. They're all caught committing perjury. So there is never a credible accuser against Michael Jackson. There's never any credible corroborative evidence against Michael Jackson. There is just nothing. I mean, in the Geordie Chandler case, they never even had probable cause to arrest him, and you really don't need a lot to arrest someone. They never even arrested him. They certainly never charged him. They took the case to 2 grand juries, and they couldn't get an indictment. So, this has never been a strong case. So what you have really with the Michael Jackson allegations is a very weak case surrounded by a $1 billion advertising campaign, just through the world's media, which amplifies these not particularly credible allegations to the point where eventually everybody just associates the name Michael Jackson with child abuse, despite the fact that there's never been a compelling case.
Well, if people have heard this before on my previous shows, I apologize, but this is something the mainstream media continues to ignore, so it must be repeated. He was investigated for decades by powerful segments of law enforcement, from the LAPD, Child Protective Services, the Santa Barbara County Sheriffs, who also ransacked his ranch in 2 unannounced raids. There have been multiple investigations by the FBI. Yes, I repeat, the FBI, which had a 300-page report on him, according to Forbes. WikiLeaks just revealed a 17-year investigation that the FBI had on him until his death in 2009. He was investigated for almost 2 decades by all these powerful factions of law enforcement, and they found absolutely no evidence of any wrongdoing. They found no evidence of wrongdoing on him personally, but here is what is most important about all these allegations against him, in my opinion, and I believe you'll agree with this, Charles. In all these investigations, and correct me if I'm wrong, there wasn't any documented evidence of any cover-up, any middlemen, any handlers, transactions of hush money regarding checks or wire transfers. There isn't any evidence of intimidation tactics regarding threats of bodily harm to assure people's cooperation or silence. So I'll shift this back to you. Isn't this even more impressive with there being no evidence of a cover-up in all these investigations?
Well, when Michael came on trial in 2005, he was specifically charged with conspiracy. So he was charged with abuse, with giving an intoxicating agent to a child to facilitate abuse, and with a conspiracy to cover up the abuse, although because of various problems with the prosecution case, they quite bizarrely accused him of orchestrating the cover-up of the abuse before he'd actually committed the abuse, which was something that catastrophically damaged their case. Now, what happened with the 2005 case was you had the accusers told a story about how they were pressured into defending Michael Jackson on camera. They were held against their will at Neverland Ranch. Efforts were made to keep them away from their home and away from the press. And they felt uncomfortable and as though they were at the center of a conspiracy. Now, elements of that story stacked up. There were people from Michael Jackson's world who did give evidence to support some of that. So there was a guy called Jesus Salas who said that he understood that there were instructions on the ranch that they were to be watched and that they shouldn't leave. There was a PR lady called Ann Christian, or Ann Gabriel. She had two names. It wasn't Ann Christian. Anyway, Ann Gabriel, and she had another pseudonym. She testified that she was working on Michael Jackson's PR, and she received a phone call one day to say that the family had tried to leave the ranch and had been prevented from doing so. And she was so disturbed by being told that she immediately rang her lawyer and said, "I don't know what to do because I've just heard something that sounds like a criminal offense."
Right.
Now, what happened was the certain elements of this conspiracy story completely fell down. So at the very least, the family of accusers were embellishing. They told all sorts of crazy stories like, we weren't allowed to know what time it was. We weren't even allowed to look at clocks. They kept us like hostages in a prison.
Right.
And, Michael Jackson's ranch was covered in like 6-foot-tall clocks.
Right.
So there were elements of that conspiracy case which were clearly bananas from the beginning. But also, the one person that they were never able to implicate was Michael Jackson.
Right.
So at one point, they called a guy in to present all of this evidence of phone calls between the various, what they called unindicted co-conspirators. So the only person they charged was Michael Jackson, and he was basically the only person that couldn't be connected to it in any way. So they produced this massive chart of all the phone calls. This person called that person, who in turn called that person, which organized this, and then that happened, and this person called that person. The first question Tom Mesereau, Michael Jackson's lawyer, asks on cross-examination is, all right, I've got one question. Where's Michael Jackson?
Right.
There's not one phone call to or from Michael Jackson.
Right.
The same PR lady, Ann Gabriel, who says that she was disturbed when she heard that the family were being prevented from leaving the ranch, also testifies that she believes Michael Jackson knew absolutely nothing about what was going on,
Right.
and goes further than that and testifies that she formed the view that Michael Jackson's team was actively working against his own best interests,
Right.
because they had ulterior motives. Then you had other members of Michael Jackson's staff who basically laughed at the very suggestion that Michael Jackson could be involved in a criminal conspiracy,
Right.
because Michael Jackson is so heavily dependent on drugs at this time. He had a chronic painkiller addiction because he'd had an accident on stage in 1999
Okay.
and had badly damaged his back. He had been prescribed painkillers and had then become dependent on those painkillers. There were members of staff who were interviewed by the police, and in their police interviews they said he couldn't even talk. He would be walking around the ranch like a zombie, and you'd go up and try and talk to him, and his eyes would be rolled back in his head.
Right.
And he'd try to talk to you in response, but all that would come out was gurgling. They said he was completely on another planet. He was so doped up.
Right.
The idea that he could have been masterminding this gigantic criminal conspiracy is insane. So what the evidence showed at trial was that there was some degree of conspiracy between various people in Michael Jackson's camp,
Right.
Perhaps well-intentioned, perhaps with the sole intention of removing the Arvizo family,
Right.
from the maelstrom of the Martin Bashir documentary, getting them out of their house into a place of safety,
Right.
and then keeping an eye on them so that they couldn't be harassed by journalists and tricked into saying something bad,
Right.
or something that could be twisted, or perhaps so that they couldn't be offered made an offer they couldn't refuse, like, we'll give you $1 million if you say something bad about Michael Jackson, which would not be unprecedented.
Exactly. Right.
So that, yes, there was an agreement between certain people within Michael Jackson's camp to try to keep the Casios away from the media, but there was absolutely zero evidence that Michael Jackson knew a single thing about it.
Right.
So you had basically an organization around Michael Jackson which was operating separately from him and just sort of going into a crisis management mode, but doing it with no direction and with no say-so from Michael Jackson.
Wow. Like I said, ruthless efficiency. It's just, just crazy. So I want to talk about Oprah. You mentioned Oprah. So I want to talk about Oprah and her appearance on The Daily Show. And I want to talk about Oprah in the bigger picture of the narrative. So, so she's on the Daily Show with Trevor Noah, and the excuse, and the excuse always when Safechuck and Robson are caught in a lie, which is often, the narrative is is often is a trauma of sexual abuse. So on the Daily Show, so for people who don't know, so on the Daily Show with Trevor Noah, he asked Oprah about the train station timeline discrepancy. And then she says something like, victims are not going to be accurate with time. They're not going to remember if it's a Thursday or a Wednesday. Now here's the deal. Safechuck provided a story that didn't exist. He said he was molested in a location that didn't exist. That has nothing to do with remembering when you were molested on a Thursday or a Wednesday. So, so whether it's Oprah or anybody that believes in Michael's guilt, every time a Safechuck and Robson lie is exposed, which again is like very often, the excuse is the trauma of remembering sexual abuse is not always going to be accurate. And to be fair, that's absolutely true in many cases. But with Safechuck and Robson, especially in this documentary, they are very meticulous, detailed, and thorough about what happened to them, where it happened to them, and when it happened to them. So when their very detailed and vivid stories of sexual abuse is shredded to pieces with facts and evidence, all of a sudden it's because of the trauma of remembering sexual abuse. I mean, like, so what do you make of all that?
Well, this whole thing about trauma, firstly, it is very true that
Absolutely.
People who have been victims of abuse can get details confused.
Absolutely.
And they can fail to remember things that they later remember and all that kind of stuff. That's absolutely true.
Absolutely.
But the problem is that the day you start making that excuse for victims and saying, well, we have to believe them anyway,
right? Because
it's probably just trauma. We have to believe them anyway. Well, that is the death of justice.
Right.
That justice does not exist anymore. The day you start saying it doesn't matter if an accuser has all their facts wrong and is proven to be telling a story that can't be true, we should just convict the person anyway because it's just trauma. I mean, that basically means that no innocent person can ever be acquitted again.
Right.
It means that any person who's accused of a crime, a sex crime, and who presents a defense, a strong defense, which says that these people their story doesn't make any sense. Their dates are wrong. The locations are wrong. It doesn't add up at all. They're going to be convicted anyway. It basically means there is no defense. There is literally no defense.
Right.
I mean, in the case of James Safechuck, he even describes, for example, he says that Michael Jackson came to his house on a particular Thanksgiving, and it turns out that Michael Jackson was not even in America on that Thanksgiving. He was on the other side of the world in Australia on stage being filmed in a concert.
Right.
Now, if the day you start saying, well, it doesn't matter if the defendant was on the other side of the world in Australia, it's probably just trauma. You should just convict them anyway.
Right.
I mean, I can scarcely think of anything more dangerous. That's absolutely terrifying. The idea that somebody would suggest that we should just ignore all of these massive, glaring inconsistencies and lies and dismiss them as trauma and just assume that somebody's guilty anyway. That's absolutely terrifying.
Right.
So, it disturbs me. It really disturbs me.
Well, because no, you, I can hear the frustration. It's just maddening. And so, no, because I wanted to talk about, we know victimhood. Again, as a person who covered child sex abuse scandals and cases before, I want to ask you this. We know victimhood is not a perfect science. We know that an abused wife will leave her husband and then in many cases come back to him. And it's not always because of fear. They return sometimes because they love their husband that much, even though he constantly abuses them. So, again, so we know victimhood is not a perfect science, but Wade Robson to me is like a special case. Okay. So let me run down the list. So Michael Jackson is sexually abusing him all these years, but he has a 10-year relationship with his niece, Brandy Jackson. And according to the timeline, he continued to have a serious relationship with her about 5 to 6 years, after the abuse. So then he becomes engaged to be married and decides he wants to get married at Neverland Ranch during the 2005 trial, by the way. So he wants to get married at the site that is responsible for his childhood sexual abuse memories. Then Michael passes away. He begs the family, can he attend the funeral, in which eventually they oblige and invite him to the funeral, and he attends. Then 2 years later, he wants to be the lead director of Michael Jackson's One show in Las Vegas. He gets rejected from the job. Then all of a sudden, the rest is history. And now he's a sexual abuse victim trying to shop a book about his abuse. So again, victimhood is not a perfect science. I know this. But as a person who has covered child sexual abuse cases, have you ever heard of a child molestation victim craving to be in their abuser's world, as Robson wanted to be in Michael's world before and after his death? Have you seen cases like this before? Have you ever seen cases? Like, I've never heard this in my life.
No, I have not either in any of the cases that I've covered.
Right.
You have with Robson a catalogue of very suspicious behaviour.
Right.
Ever since he started claiming abuse he tries to shop a book and then lies about it. He's asked in legal proceedings against the Michael Jackson estate. He's asked if he's ever discussed the case with anyone except his lawyers. He says no. It turns out he's actually discussed it with publishing agents. Then he says, well, yeah, I did write a book, but it was never given to anybody to read. And then emails are produced, which shows that it was actually given to loads of publishers. So he kept lying about that.
Right.
He was asked to produce his emails as evidence, and he fought to keep those emails out of court. And then the emails were turned over, and there were some very worrying emails amongst them. For example, the emails showed that he had been researching other people's allegations against Michael Jackson and then emailing himself the links. Then you had the fact that in his very first claim against the estate, the creditor's claim, which was filed in 2013, he claimed, because a creditor's claim must be brought within a certain amount of time after a person dies.
Right.
And his was late. His was brought 4 years after Michael Jackson's death, or just under 4 years. And as an excuse, he said, well, the reason I didn't file a claim earlier is because, A, I didn't realize that I'd been sexually abused, and B, I didn't realize that Michael Jackson had an estate that I could sue. Well, actually, evidence was produced that he had not only known that Michael Jackson had an estate, but he had been involved in ongoing discussions and negotiations with that estate, trying to get a job from them, as you said, on the Michael Jackson 1 Cirque du Soleil show.
Right.
He had met with the estate, he had corresponded with the estate, and even prior to that, so that all started in 2011, 2 years before he claimed under oath that he knew the estate existed. But even prior to that, in 2009, so the year of Michael Jackson's death, he attends an estate movie premiere. He attends the premiere of the This Is It movie.
Right.
So that was organized by Michael Jackson's estate. Who did he think had laid that on? But at the very least, we know that he was involved in correspondence and negotiation with the Michael Jackson estate from 2011, and then he claims under oath that he didn't know that the estate existed until 2013. So he's perjured himself. That's unequivocal perjury.
Right.
And the judge, it went to summary judgment, and in a summary judgment, the judge replaces the jury and is legally bound to presume in favor of the plaintiff. So he was legally bound to presume in favor of Robson as he went through his decision-making process. So in a summary judgment case, the judge must rule in favor of the plaintiff on every point where the judge feels that a rational juror could believe the story. Well, there was hard evidence which showed that Robson had been in negotiations with Michael Jackson's estate from 2011, but was now claiming under oath that he didn't know it existed until 2013. So the judge had no choice but to rule that a rational juror could not believe that part of his case, and therefore he ruled the summary judgment in favor of Michael Jackson's estate, in favor of the defense, which is a rarity in a summary judgment case because the judge has to presume everything in favor of the plaintiff.
Right.
So that's very damaging to him. Then you have the various difficulties with his story. So he claims that Michael Jackson began molesting him when his family went on holiday to the Grand Canyon, and they left him behind. And Michael Jackson seized on this opportunity of having Wade Robson there without his family to start abusing him. Wade Robson's family have all testified under oath that he was there at the Grand Canyon with them.
Right.
So that part of his story doesn't add up. Then you have his constantly changing story about how he came to testify in 2005 for Michael Jackson's defense, beginning with, I didn't realize I'd been abused.
Right.
And then morphing into, well, I did know I'd been abused, but I didn't want to be responsible for orphaning his children, so I decided to testify in his defense. And then morphing into, I was threatened and bullied by Michael Jackson and his lawyers. So that story keeps changing. There are massive problems with his story.
Right.
And, to the point where you could take any one of those issues that I've just listed, and that would be sufficient grounds on which to say, this guy has problems with his story, and you cannot believe it. You cannot believe it to beyond a reasonable doubt. But when you add it all together, I mean, it's catastrophically damaging.
When we were emailing each other back and forth, for a couple months, and we couldn't reach each other for a minute. I sent you a link to my previous show where I interviewed Michael Jackson's bodyguard. Did you ever get to listen to that?
No.
You didn't get to...
I mean, I know who he is. And
right, Bill Whitfield.
He's been saying.
Right, Bill Whitfield.
Bill Whitfield.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I guess in the documentary, Robson talks about some cookout in 2008 at Neverland. Do you remember that part of the documentary in 2008?
I remember. I remember the story from previous interviews that Wade Robson has given. I think he mentioned it. He wrote a chapter in the Michael Jackson Opus, which was an official estate book,
right.
Funnily enough, back when he didn't know the estate existed, of course. And in that, I think he recalls that in that chapter.
Okay. Yeah.
About how the final time he saw Michael was when he had a barbecue with him or something.
Yeah, but that's what I'm getting at, where like Bill Whitfield was with him every single day of his life from 2006 to 2009. And he says he was with him every single day of his life as his head of security. And he said this cookout never happened. He said it never happened. And he said, I mean, it's like Wade Robson is a grown ass man now. So, and so he's lying again. Like he's lying again when he's a grown man. So, I mean, is this the side effects of sexual trauma? Like to lie when you're grown? It just keeps going. It keeps going. So
yeah, it's become like a blanket excuse for any time these guys say anything that comes into question.
Right.
They just say, "Oh, well, it's the trauma of childhood abuse," and then they wheel in these crazy experts who are basically just their whole job is to advocate for child abuse, so that they will never ever say that anything is indicative of somebody not being abused.
Right.
I mean, after the documentary came out, there was one expert who was on TV saying, no, it's actually quite normal for a child abuse victim to want to direct a multi-million-dollar spectacular for Cirque du Soleil in memory of their abuser. That's quite normal. They'll just say anything is normal.
Right.
They will say, and it's true.
Right.
Because child abuse is a very big issue, and there are millions of victims out there. Some victims grow up to become completely well-adjusted and live perfectly normal, happy lives. Others end up committing suicide.
Correct.
Or become chronic drug addicts,
right.
Or suffer from depression, or develop other mental issues. And all of these people would be classic victims,
right.
Because there are so many victims out there that the whole spectrum is there. So you can bring these experts in, and you can describe to them two completely oppositional personality types. You can have one guy over in the corner who's hugging his knees and is a chronic heroin addict and has spent his whole life in and out of prison, and the expert will go, yep, classic victim, classic child abuse victim, that's absolutely classic. And then you can have another guy on the other side of the room who's grown up and become a really successful businessman and is married with kids, and they go,
right.
Yep, that's perfectly normal. So
right.
There's nothing you can describe that they will not say is normal for a child abuse victim. So it's kind of, again, it's like a catch-all situation. They just wheel out these experts who really are not experts in anything, because it doesn't matter what you say to them. They'll always say, yeah, that's totally normal, and they're definitely a victim.
In my interview with Bill Whitfield, I mentioned that my godfather,
has shared duties as head of security for the Jacksons since 1971, and
wow.
his name is Bobby Adams, and he was also head of security for other people like Tom Bradley, and Lionel Richie, and he knew Michael ever since he was 13 years old. Okay, and about a week before I interviewed Bill Whitfield, I had a chance to talk to my godfather about Michael and these recent allegations. And just like Whitfield, he loved him. You know, he absolutely loved him. He swore by his character and his nature. And I asked him about these allegations, and he responded sort of impatiently and said, none of this crap is true, and it's just a money grab. But here's the main thing. He knew Michael since he was 13 years old, all the way to his mid-20s, his developmental years as a boy, you know, and a young man. And he said there was never a hint of suspicious behavior towards children or anybody. And again, he was basically around Michael every day of his life for most of those years. So my question is, it appears the more people that know Michael, the more favorable the opinion about him as a person becomes. In all the research you've done on him throughout the years, do you get that sense?
Yeah, there's a very clear divide.
Right.
So you have a lot of people. Obviously, Michael Jackson comes into contact with a lot of people.
Right.
Over the years. I'm struggling to think of anybody that knew Michael Jackson very well and very intimately who has ever said that they believe he's guilty.
Right.
I mean, you know, what you find is people on the periphery, often people with a grudge because they've been sacked from their job or something like that, they will, if they're offered money, for example, or if they're trying to sue him and they want leverage, they will accuse him. So people like, there was a maid who was featured in a lot of documentaries recently called Adrian Mcmanus.
Yes, I heard of her.
So
yes. Mm-hmm.
This is a lady who was sacked from Michael Jackson's estate, Neverland, for offences including stealing his underwear and selling it to fans, stealing his artwork, stealing his clothes, and she's sacked justifiably, and then teams up with some other sacked employees and tries to sue Michael Jackson for wrongful termination. And it's admitted at Michael's trial that these former employees who decide to bring this lawsuit are given legal advice by a lawyer who says, given that the Geordie Chandler case was going on at the time, if you were to say that you saw something inappropriate, that might be the leverage that's needed to force a settlement here, even though they've all previously testified that they never saw anything inappropriate happen.
Right.
So McManus, for example, she then suddenly starts claiming that she saw inappropriate behavior, which she's never said before, sells stories for huge amounts of money, uses it as leverage in a lawsuit, which she loses. And at one point, the judge in that case, it was called the Neverland 5 case, the judge is so disgusted by these complainants that at one point he stands up and walks out of court and says, I can't even bear to sit here and look at you at the moment. I can't even bear to sit here and look at you. So Michael Jackson wins that case, and the complainants are all ordered to pay his legal fees. So they end up owing Michael Jackson millions of dollars. So this is a lady who is a thief, has previously testified that she saw nothing inappropriate, later admits on the stand that she's a perjurer, and has brought a false wrongful termination suit against Michael Jackson, and now owes Michael Jackson millions of dollars, and then goes on to have a long history of selling stories about Michael Jackson to the press, which turn out to be completely bogus. She's now being bandied around from station to station and newspaper to newspaper in light of the Leaving Neverland documentary, and being described as a trusted member of Michael Jackson's inner circle, who's breaking her silence to reveal the stuff that she saw. And you just go, what are you talking about? It's just absolute nonsense. It's just complete and utter nonsense. And these are the kind of characters who crawled out of the woodwork when Michael Jackson was under fire, and for money and for leverage started accusing him of things. Now, you will not find, for example, somebody like Karen Faye. Karen Faye was Michael Jackson's makeup artist, so she was intimately involved with him at all times. You know, she was personally responsible for because of his vitiligo, because of the Pepsi burns that he had to his scalp, he required a lot of work sometimes to get him looking presentable.
Right.
And so this is a woman that he allowed to see him at his most vulnerable, in a state that he would never, ever allow anybody else to see him. And she is absolutely 100% devout in her belief that there is absolutely no truth to these allegations. So that's the difference within the Michael Jackson camp. As you say, the proximity is if you were close to Michael Jackson, if you really knew him, none of those people say that he was guilty. None of them. They all stand by him to this day. His technical director, who was all over his house, Brad Sundberg, who says, I went into every nook and cranny of Neverland. I was under his bed because I wired the whole house for sound. Right. I was allowed access to any part of the ranch that I wanted at any time because I was constantly going in to tweak the electrics and that sort of thing. Never saw anything remotely suspicious. Then you have Karen Fay. You have the photographer Harrison Funk, who was around Michael Jackson for decades, says, absolutely, I don't believe any of this. The list goes on and on.
Right.
And you just have these peripheral characters, the people that came into Michael Jackson's life for a brief period and then disappeared because they got caught doing something they shouldn't be doing or whatever, got sacked or ended up in litigation with him. And those are the ones that turn. And when money's on the table, when there's a tabloid waving a check around, they decide that they've seen something bad, and again, there's never been an employee or somebody that was in Michael Jackson's circle who has made a bad comment about him in relation to these allegations, who's not turned out to have either a gigantic grudge or a massive financial motive, or both.
We're almost out of time, so I just got one last question. Just one last question. You've been great so far with this interview, so I got one last question. Because of all the lies that has come up about in this documentary, I see MJ fans all across social media and across the world represent two camps of thought, so to speak. There are MJ fans that say the pieces are coming together and eventually this documentary would be seen as a sham, but there are other MJ fans that say the pieces have already come together and Leaving Neverland has already been exposed as a sham. So I'm in the camp that says the pieces have already come together and the documentary has been proven to be fake and just flat out bogus. Am I being too bold in saying that?
I think it depends what perspective you're looking at it from. So I believe that this documentary has been fundamentally discredited in terms of the journalistic practice, in the sense that the director didn't give anybody a right of reply. He didn't do proper fact checking. There are massive glaring errors in the documentary which shouldn't have gone in there. There was the misleading editing of the lawyer's press conference, where he made it look like Mark Geragos was threatening victims when he wasn't.
Yeah, I saw that.
All that kind of stuff. There have been huge problems with this documentary. Contradictory statements. There was a statement by Wade Robson's wife, which contradicted a statement that they made on their website looking for money. Yeah, there's been huge contradictions. So has the documentary been massively discredited? Yes. Is the general public aware that the documentary has been massively discredited? No, in my opinion, because the media, by and large, is refusing to report on the massive problems with this documentary.
But does it matter? I guess my question is, but the interruption, because we're definitely out of time, we're running late. Does it matter if the mainstream media picks it up or not? Because if it's fake, it's fake. If it's lies, it's lies, whether the mainstream media picks it up or not.
I agree to an extent, but public sentiment guides everything. So you've got The Simpsons pulling their episode, you've got radio stations pulling Michael Jackson off the air, etc. That's where that gap between public sentiment and media sentiment becomes important, because you have all these decisions being taken not really based on public sentiment. Public sentiment is not that bad against Michael Jackson. It's these decisions are being taken based on outlandish media reporting and dishonest media reporting. Michael Jackson's winning every poll. If you look online, there was a Fox News poll. Should Michael Jackson's Cirque du Soleil show be shut down in Vegas? It was like 90% no. he was winning every poll. And yet the media was basically forcing all of these brands and companies into taking his music off their playlists and taking the Simpsons episode out of rotation, and the fashion line that said we're pulling all Michael Jackson references from our fashion line. It's not based on public sentiment. It's based purely on media hype. And that is outrageous, really. You have a media which is firstly engaging in deliberate deception in its reporting on this documentary. It's willful obfuscation of the facts and refusal to report on the other side of the story, even though everybody knows that there are massive problems with these accusers and with the documentary. And then they're also kind of leading a lynch mob, a media lynch mob, which is dismantling Michael Jackson's legacy based on allegations that they know not to be credible, and in direct defiance of genuine public opinion, which is actually not that bad. So the media comes out of this, in my opinion, is kind of worse than Wade and Jimmy. Wade and Jimmy, at least at the end of the day, they're going to, they hope they're going to make tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars if they win their lawsuit.
Right.
Whereas what's the media's motive? It seems to be purely kind of agenda driven. It seems to be ideological. It seems to be a kind of a philosophy that we don't like Michael Jackson's kind and we want him destroyed.
Right.
And that's far more disturbing to me.
Well, there you have it. Well, that's it for today. Charles Thomson, award-winning journalist. I want to thank you for being on my show.
Oh, no, thank you very much for having me.
Be sure to rate and comment on Apple Podcasts. Give us a 5-star rating and a great comment, and we may read your comment in a future episode. So stay tuned for that. You can also email me at theauthority@gmail.com. That's the authority, TheAuthority. That's 2 Y's. Theauthority@gmail.com. And you can also leave a comment, and I may read your comment in a future episode. You can also post comments on Twitter at Sanford Richmond, and my handle is at @SRichmond. That's SRICHMOND 231. This is the Authority Podcast. I want to thank you for listening, and join us again next time.